Hello, my dear friends. We are back, page 280, the very last paragraph of the page under the section, The Cambrian Explosion. Are you ready? What did this stunning discovery mean? It meant that the bottom of the geological column, as presented in textbooks, still to this day, is wrong. Walcott found fossils of the simple animals that were supposed to be in Cambrian rock, but he also found thousands of examples of animals that were too complex to have evolved in the short time represented by Cambrian rock. According to the geological column, some of these animals were supposed to have formed much later in the times represented by Silurian and Devonian rock. Why in the world were these complex fossils found in Cambrian rock? Walcott had no real answer to that question. In other words, Walcott had discovered something revolutionary. This was a find that would radically alter the scientific world's understanding of the geological column. What then do you think he did? What would you do if you discovered something so revolutionary? I would think that you would publicize it so that the whole world could see it. That's not what Walcott did, however. He wrote a few modest articles in an extremely obscure scientific journal, Smithsonian Miscellaneous Collection. And then he reburied the fossils in his laboratory drawers, and he never mentioned them again. It would be 80 years before the fossils were rediscovered and their importance understood. What is their importance? As we mentioned, they tell us that the first few layers of the geological column, as presented in the geological column, are simply false. After all, the geological column pictures of the animals in the simple phyla evolving into the animals of the more complex phyla over a period of about 170 million years, from Cambrian rock to somewhere in the middle of Devonian rock. This, however, is not what the fossils say. The fossils discovered by Walcott, more than 60,000 in all, some of which are reconstructed in the figure below, and those discovered later by others, tell us that all of the major animal phyla can be found in Cambrian rock. These fossils lead to a serious problem for macroevolution. All macroevolutionists agree that macroevolution takes a long time. No one presently understands how such a huge amount of evolution could have taken place in the relatively short time supposedly represented by Cambrian rock. Even if the currently assumed ages for Cambrian rock are correct, it took only 70 million years for evolution to go from the simplest animal phyla to the most complex animal phyla. At present, no one understands how this could have happened in the context of macroevolution. In fact, the problem is so well known in the field of paleontology, it has a name. It is called the Cambrian explosion, which refers to the fact that there seems to have been an explosion of life in Cambrian times. Not only is the short time a problem for macroevolution, But the fossils themselves present a real problem as well. Even though the fact that there are no intermediate links in the fossil record is a well known problem for macroevolution, the problem is much more dramatic in Cambrian rock. After all, a huge amount of macroevolution had to have occurred in the time represented by Cambrian rock. But there's just no evidence for it. There aren't even possible transitional forms like Archaeopteryx or Australopithecus. In fact, the creatures that are fossilized in Cambrian rock just appear there suddenly, exactly as you would expect if each of these creatures was simply made by God. One of the most honest summaries of the problem that the Cambrian explosion presents to macroevolution is given by prominent macroevolutionist Richard Dawkins. It is as though fossils, were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Both schools of thought, punctuationists and gradualists, despise so called scientific creationists equally, and both agree that the major gaps are real, that they are true imperfections in the fossil record. The only alternative explanation of the sudden appearance of so many complex animal types in the Cambrian era is divine creation, and we both reject this alternative. Notice how honest Dr. Dawkins is in this quote. He tells us that the fossils seem to have just appeared there without any evidence of evolution whatsoever. He says that both schools of macroevolutionists, we will discuss punctuationists and gradualists later, but they agree that even though the fossils seem to indicate that the creatures were created divinely, they must reject that notion. And they must therefore assume that the appearance of planting is just due to imperfections in the fossil record. Well, what does he mean by imperfections? He means that the intermediate links did indeed exist, but they just happen to not have been fossilized. This is what you are forced to believe if you look at the fossil record and reject the most obvious conclusion that it presents, that the organisms preserved there were divinely created. Structural homology, formerly evidence for macroevolution, now evidence against it. Let's move, guys, into this new section at the bottom of page 282. Another piece of evidence that Darwin detailed in his book came from comparing the structures that are found in representatives of vastly different species. The study of similar structures in different species is called structural homology. Structural homology, the study of similar structures in different species. The best way to understand why Darwin considered structural homology to be evidence for macroevolution is to show you a figure. Notice in the figure that although these arm bones come from very different species, they have an amazing amount in common. They all are jointed about halfway down. They all have a single upper arm bone, the humerus, which is green in the figure. They then have two lower arm bones, the radius, which is colored purple, and the ulna, which is colored blue. They all end in a palm consisting of carpels, which are colored red, metacarpals, which are colored yellow, and phalanges, which are colored gray. Indeed, with the exception of the bird, they all have 5 sets of phalanges. Darwin said that these incredible similarities among such vastly different species were excellent evidence that they all had a common ancestor. After all, he said, that common ancestor probably had a forearm which was jointed in the middle, had a humerus, followed by a radius, and an ulna, followed by carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. This general forearm structure, then, over eons of time, and guided by natural selection, simply adapted to the needs of each individual species as it arose. Thus, much like you can tell that a man and his brother's grandson are related by a common ancestor because of their striking similarities, you can assume that man and the bat are related by a common ancestor because of the striking similarities in their forearms. In Darwin's time, structural homology was very strong evidence for macroevolution. How could vastly different species have such similar characteristics unless they were all related by a common ancestor? If they all had a common ancestor, then clearly macroevolution would have to have occurred in order to turn this common ancestor into these vastly different species, right? That sounded like a great argument in Darwin's time because scientists back then had no idea how traits were passed on from generation to generation. With the advent of Mendelian genetics, however, scientists finally began to understand how this happens. As scientists began to understand genetics and DNA better, they developed technology to actually determine the sequence of nucleotide bases in an organism's DNA. This spelled the end of structural homology as evidence of macroevolution. You see, if structural homology was the result of common ancestry, it should show up in the genetic codes of the organisms that possess similar structures. Take, for example, the forearms shown in figure 9.6. If the forearms of the bat, bird, man, and porpoise look so similar because they all inherited their forearms from a common ancestor, then the parts of their DNA that contain the information regarding the forearms should be similar. After all, traits are passed from parent to offspring through DNA. If each one of these creatures inherited its forearm structure from a common ancestor, then the portions of DNA which contain information about the forearm would all have come from that same common ancestor. As a result, those portions of the DNA should be similar from organism to organism. Is this the case? Is structural homology the result of similar DNA sequences? No, it is not. Read the words of Dr. Michael Denton. The evolutionary basis of homology is perhaps even more severely damaged by the discovery that apparently homologous structures are specified by quite different genes in different species. With the demise of any sort of straightforward explanation for homology, one of the major pillars of evolution theory has become so weakened that its value as evidence for evolution is greatly diminished. Notice what Dr. Denton says here. Apparently, homologous structures are specified by quite different genes in different species. Well, if they are specified by different genes, then there is no way that the homologous structures could have been inherited from a common ancestor. As basic genetics tell us, the only way to inherit something from an ancestor is through the genetic code. This is why Dr. Denton concludes by saying that the value of homology as evidence for evolution is greatly diminished. To creation scientists, figure 9.6 actually offers excellent evidence for a creator. After all, any good engineer, once he finds a design that works, tends to stick with that design and simply adapts it from situation to situation. Thus, structural homology is, to creation scientists, evidence of common design. Common design, not common ancestry. Think about what we have learned so far. Darwin's two greatest evidences for macroevolution were the geological column and structural homology. As we have seen, based on today's understanding of science, the geological column provides inconclusive evidence, and structural homology now provides evidence against macroevolution. In addition, the fossil record provides evidence against macroevolution. Is this the end of the story? Actually, no. It turns out that we haven't even studied the data that speak out against macroevolution the strongest. We save that for the next section. Okay, friends, I will talk to you in a little bit. We're going to pick up on page 285, beginning with molecular biology, the nail in macroevolution's coffin. See you next time. Bless you. Bye.